goes. Okay, so this interview is inquiry-based learning. So we're doing a project just about how different teachers use inquiry-based learning in their classroom and like if they do use it, how they use technology with it. So we'll go ahead and start with the first question of, do you use inquiry-based learning in your classroom?
Yes. Yeah, I definitely do. I use it to I use it a lot in social studies and science,
Okay.
and also in math. We integrate reading and social studies, so it ends up being done in reading, and I loosely, understood use inquiry-based learning both. Even down to for
Okay.
vocabulary work.
Right. So you kind of discussed how you're using it with what subjects, but how are you using it to help your students prepare for the standardized test?
Well, I thought that was the funniest question ever. And I thought about maybe trying to answer that with a straight face, but I think I'll just be blunt. I think standardized testing and the emphasis on that is making it very difficult to do. So there are ways, and many teachers are doing this. They're managing larger projects that would be more inquiry-based learning, and then using it also as an approach, even in a single lesson. The only connection to the standardized test is that you're teaching to the standard.
Right.
It doesn't help the kids on the test.
Okay. Yeah, well that's definitely a great answer because I think that that's true that this type of learning is not being as enforced as much because they want everything to be towards the standardized test, which you're saying is a little harder to do with.
Well, and that's one of the problems. I think there's some exceptions to this, but for example, last spring, our fifth graders took the social studies I-STEP, and it just asked a whole bunch of questions about Indians. And I know that my co-teacher and I covered Native Americans pretty well. Now, part of the problem might be is that where it comes in the curriculum, it comes at the beginning of the year.
Okay.
But I think the standardized test is forced just by the nature of what it is to seek answers to pretty discrete facts, and that's not the strength of inquiry-based learning.
Right.
The strength of inquiry-based learning is conceptual.
Okay. The
I
broader
think it's
topic.
possible I think it's possible for standardized tests to sort of test concepts, but so much of that's dependent on the language. We were part of a discussion last week as part of a grant that is here with Ball State and the Academy, and their teachers were saying that they know they taught this whole understanding of no taxation without representation.
Okay.
The standardized test used, I think it used the word consent. And many of the children, because of their low reading skills, had that concept about no taxation without representation that they could get from, say, inquiry-based approach, but bombed that question on the test because they didn't have that exact
The
word.
vocab. Right.
That's the difficulty. That's really the difficulty with testing that way.
Okay. Well, good. The next question says, how do you encourage your students to search for their own answers with a topic?
Well, I got introduced to this a couple of years ago when I actually was teaching a social studies methods. I just was a last-minute fill-in for a night class, and I found a social studies text for social studies methods that basically, this changed me a lot. I work with students to develop their own questions.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes I develop them just to get the full breadth of coverage that I need, but I encourage students to seek those answers even momentarily or in a systematic way for research projects, basically.
Okay.
Short and long.
All right. So then the next one was what topics, and you said you kind of mentioned those at the beginning.
Yeah.
So maybe like specifically one of those, like the like history or math. What types of larger concepts do you tend to use the inquiry-based learning with? So maybe an example of one that you've done with.
Yeah, sure. Today, in fact, we were talking about trying to, with fourth graders, fractions and decimals, as they really are pretty difficult.
Yeah.
And so I think that it worked to some extent today to talk about the relationship of fractions to decimals and get students trying to figure out which fractions matched um, which decimals without giving them that answer. Okay,
Right.
gave them a list on one side, and so that's not a great example of inquiry-based learning. Probably a much better, more holistic approach for math would be all the different strategies for solving a problem, and then going through those with the whole group and comparing strategies and just saying that there's many different ways to solve that problem. I probably use it most, besides math, and is that I have sort of a hands-on approach to observation of. Right now, I'm doing a unit on rocks and minerals and earth science type of stuff.
Right.
And both for investigation of volcanoes by internet, as well as hands-on observation of rocks and minerals, trying to figure out how they got that way.
Okay.
And asking those kinds of questions, and then using things that let them investigate the rock cycle, and then bring that back to the rocks and mineral samples and say, okay, do I see that kind of formation here?
Right. So
that makes sense.
With that technology that you're incorporating, do you just send them out on the laptop and say, search, this is what you're researching, like here are some sites to use, or how do you guide them with that technology?
I usually, because of the whole issue of internet safety, I investigate sites ahead of time and I give students sites, but inevitably they like to do Google image searches.
Right.
So rather than shut that off, though this all may be a moot point in another couple days because we're getting these pretty wild filters here.
Okay.
But I just say, look, if you want to search an image, which is proven to be a really great boon for some of the literature we read, we use trade books that are, a lot of them are historical fiction, and they like looking up names of things that they don't have a clue what it is, like what an abalone is, and that's a big issue when you're reading Island of the Blue Dolphin. So to be able to go and do an image search with Google for abalone just opens that whole text up for those students. That, I don't know if we're going to still be able to do that, but what I do is I say, look, if you want to search Google Images, you got to come and do it while I'm there, or have me over to your computer.
Right.
Most of these kids, if they happen, there's been a couple of situations where they've happened upon a questionable site, they almost immediately come right up.
Okay.
But because we've had some instances in the building lately, we're just under a lot of pressure to be very, very careful. So I do a thing called news, where I'm trying to cultivate an interest in current events, and I have only certain sites, not only because of fear of students seeing something that really wouldn't be appropriate for kids, but also because I think a lot of the news sites are pretty sensationalistic. So they can go to BBC, NPR, Time for Kids, which is a news magazine online, and Scholastic News for Kids, and then sometimes CNN, but I usually check CNN before I send them to that front page.
Okay.
Because a lot of times it's just stuff that's not worth them bothering to see. When we do a research project, I ask them to show me the Google search before they click on any of the items, or I direct them to specific sites.
Okay.
And by doing that, I have a way of directing them toward being able to discern what are better sites than others, if that makes sense to you.
Right.
Like they almost always, I think even college students do this, go to Wikipedia.
Right, yeah.
And so that's fine with me if they go to Wikipedia, but I say go to the bottom of the page first and find out who it is that wrote this and whether anybody's questioned it.
Okay.
So I'm really using the process itself to teach them how to do an authentic search.
Right.
And like when we do Native Americans and searches on various tribes, I say, what do you think? they have a list of sites to go to, and one of them's got a lot of advertisements on it, but it actually might be the tribe's own site. And so I say, what do you think about that? Is that something you think is going to be more or less authentic and true than even Wikipedia?
Right. So you're even making them do that inquiry-based learning, like within the technology, like discerning the sites that are going to give them good resource.
You can. I think it's valid inquiry-based learning to give them the sites, but if you've got the time, it's better for them to find the sites with some measure of conversation with the teacher.
Yeah. So let's see. Why do you think that inquiry-based learning is effective?
Well, I think it is extremely motivating because it puts a learner in charge of their learning to a much larger extent than reading what's provided for them. It lets them search, and that sense of ownership, it's a big motivator. I think probably the only next best motivator is this idea that somehow sort of the authenticity of task, or that they're going to get to publish it. Okay, those both are really equally motivating as this ownership issue. But probably even deeper is, I think when kids are following their own curiosity, that is, I think students are more likely to integrate that knowledge with their previous knowledge, as well as a more integrated approach. If students are interested in the Iroquois and they are given the freedom to follow up on something like lacrosse, if they're an athlete, then that ability to follow their interest to some extent, but there's constraint with things that they still have to say about the Iroquois nation. That's a lot. I think when students have that integration, it's much more meaningful to them, and they're more likely to retain it, and they're more likely to be lifelong learners. I think that's probably the biggest issue.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so let's see. In terms of like you as a teacher, how are you encouraged to use this type of learning in your classroom?
I don't think we're at a position where we're discouraged yet, per se. Like, nobody's told me not to do it.
Okay.
The problem is the amount of time that inquiry learning takes.
All right.
So then people become suspicious about your coverage. I mean, if I spend the amount of time, which could be a couple weeks, on an inquiry-based learning project for social studies, even if I'm integrating it with reading, there's all these other things that I'm not covering that'll be on the test.
Okay.
And that's a problem.
Right. So, I guess kind of back to the technology a little bit.
Yeah.
In terms of your classroom, what are you using? You guys are using iPads, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there any other, like, type of technology that you can think of that they might use to help them with this?
Well, we have a Mac lab still because we've got interface problems with Adobe Flash with those iPads. Some of that's been corrected with a particular online science text that we use. And that's a nice deal because the kids can log on to that and just say explore volcanoes all across that. In terms of it's a great differentiator. It's an easy differentiator because you can't just say, go find out what you want to find out. You can watch videos, you can do the virtual labs, whatever, about volcanoes. And that spans, that particular tech book spans K-8, I think.
Okay.
So it can go a lot farther than than where I would design most lessons.
Right. We have about 30 seconds left on this recording, so I'm